I never thought I'd learn what real silence sounded like until the night my neighbor's husband died. It wasn't the kind of silence you notice right away. It didn't crash into the room or announce itself. It slipped in slowly, the way cold does when a window has been left open somewhere you can't see. One minute there were sound sirens in the distance, muffled voices in the hallway, the hum of the building settling for the night, and then there weren't, just a thick, pressing quiet that made every small movement feel too loud. I was standing in my kitchen when it happened, staring at a glass of water I didn't remember pouring. The clock on the microwave read 11:47 p.m. I know that because later, when I tried to replay the night in my head, that number kept coming back to me like it mattered. Like if I remembered it clearly enough, I could understand why everything felt different after. The sirens faded first. Red and blue light stopped bleeding through the thin gap in my curtains. Somewhere down the hall, a door closed softly. Another followed. People retreating back into their lives. Her door didn't close. I didn't know her well. We had lived across the hall from each other for almost 2 years. Close enough to hear footsteps and muffled television sounds through the walls. Close enough to recognize each other's routines. She left early in the mornings. He came home late most nights. Sometimes they crossed paths in the hallway, exchanging quick smiles that never quite reached their eyes. We were neighbors in the most literal sense of the word, nothing more. When I stepped into the hallway, the air felt wrong, heavy, the kind of stillness that makes you lower your voice even when you're alone. Her apartment door was open just a few inches, the chain still hanging loose. Inside, the lights were on. I didn't knock at first. I stood there, unsure of what I was allowed to do, unsure of whether crossing that threshold would mean stepping into something I couldn't step back out of. Then I heard her not crying, not screaming, just breathing. Short, uneven breaths that sounded like she'd been running, even though she hadn't moved. I knocked softly and said her name. My voice sounded strange in my own ears. Too loud. Too solid for the moment. She didn't answer. I pushed the door open a little more, and saw her sitting on the floor near the couch, wrapped in a blanket that looked too thin to offer any real warmth. Her hands were clasped together so tightly her knuckles were white. Her eyes were open, fixed on a spot somewhere past the wall, like she was looking through it instead of at it. There was a police officer standing nearby, his posture careful, respectful. He gave me a brief nod, the kind that said he had already said everything there was to say, and none of it had been enough. Her husband was gone. The words didn't fully register at first. They floated somewhere between us, too big and too final to land all at once. I knew what they meant in theory, but my mind refused to connect them to the woman sitting on the floor in front of me, to the quiet apartment that still smelled faintly of coffee and whatever they'd had for dinner that night. She hadn't cried yet. That struck me later, when I had time to think about it. In that moment, all I noticed was how still she was. Like if she didn't move, the truth might not catch up to her. The officer asked if I lived nearby, if I knew her, if I could stay close for a bit once they left. I said yes before he finished the sentence. After they were gone, after the official sounds of the night had disappeared, there was nothing left but us, and the hum of the refrigerator, and the faint buzz of the overhead light. I stood there awkwardly, unsure where to put my hands, unsure whether sitting down would feel too familiar or standing would feel too distant. I can make tea, I offered, because it was the only useful sentence my brain could come up with. She nodded once, just once, still not looking at me. I don't remember much about that night after that. I remember filling the kettle. I remember the sound of the water heating, too loud in the small kitchen. I remember placing a mug in front of her and watching her hands shake as she wrapped them around it. She didn't drink it. When I finally left, sometime after midnight, her door was still open. I hesitated, then gently pulled it closed behind me, leaving the chain loose the way it had been. I don't know why I did that. Maybe I thought it would make it easier for her to open it again if she needed to. I lay awake for hours that night, staring at the ceiling, listening to the building settle. Every now and then I thought I heard movement from across the hall, but I couldn't be sure. Grief, I learned later, has a way of making you imagine sounds that aren't there. The next day, people filled the hallway. Family members I had never seen before. Friends who hugged her tightly and spoke in low voices. Neighbors who suddenly remembered her name, who pressed plates of food into her hands and told her to call if she needed anything. For a while, it looked like she wouldn't be alone by the third day. The hallway was quiet again. The plates of food sat untouched by her door. Flowers wilted slowly in cheap vases. Cards leaned against the wall, their messages full of words that tried to explain something that couldn't be explained. I saw her a few times that week. Once, standing in the doorway, staring down at the carpet like it might give her instructions on what to do next. Another time, in the parking lot, sitting in her car with the engine off, hands on the steering wheel, not going anywhere. I didn't say much. I nodded. I asked if she needed anything. She always shook her head. It wasn't until we found ourselves alone in the elevator, one morning, that she finally spoke. The doors slid shut, trapping us in the small mirrored box. I pressed the button for the lobby. The elevator started its slow descent. "You don't have to ask how I'm doing," she said quietly. I glanced at her, unsure if I'd heard her correctly. "Everyone does," she continued, still staring straight ahead. "They ask, and then they look relieved when I say I'm okay, even though we both know I'm lying." I didn't say anything. The floor numbers ticked by slowly. No one waits for the real answer, she said. The elevator reached the lobby and came to a stop. The doors opened. She didn't move. Something in me understood what she was asking without her having to say it out loud. So I waited. The doors slid shut again. The elevator started moving, this time upward. Her shoulders shook once, then again. The sound she made when she finally cried wasn't loud. It was small and broken, like something tearing quietly. I don't know who I am without him, she said, her voice barely more than a whisper, and I don't even know if I'm allowed to say that. I didn't try to fix it. I didn't tell her it would be okay or that time would help or any of the other things people say when they don't know what else to do. I just stayed there. When the elevator stopped again, she wiped her face quickly, embarrassed, and stepped out without another word. I watched her walk away, the weight of her grief lingering in the air long after she was gone. After that, things changed. Not all at once. Not dramatically. We started talking in small, accidental moments. A few words in the hallway, a brief conversation by the mailboxes, eventually, longer pauses where neither of us seemed in a hurry to leave. One evening, she knocked on my door. "I'm sorry," she said immediately, like she was already preparing to be turned away. I don't feel like being alone tonight." I stepped aside and let her in. We sat across from each other at my small kitchen table, cups of coffee between us that slowly went cold. She told me about her marriage, but not in the way people usually do when they talk about someone who's died. She didn't paint him as a saint. She didn't list his flaws either. She talked about the quiet, how lonely it is, she said, staring into her cup, to share a bed with someone who's already checked out, to fall asleep next to a person who doesn't really see you anymore. She told me she'd felt guilty for years for wanting more. More conversation, more warmth, more acknowledgement that she existed beyond the roles she played. And now, she said softly, I feel guilty for feeling relieved that I don't have to keep pretending anymore. She looked up at me then, her eyes searching my face like she was bracing herself for judgment. I don't know if that makes me a terrible person. It makes you human, I said. The word seemed to surprise her. She let out a breath she'd been holding and nodded slowly. We didn't touch, we didn't sit too close. There was an invisible line between us, clear and unspoken, and we both respected it. Still, something shifted. It wasn't attraction, at least not in the way people usually mean it. It was recognition. Two people seeing each other clearly, at a moment when neither of us had the energy to pretend. The night she knocked on my door again, it was raining. I remember that detail, clearly the sound of it against the windows. Steady and relentless, like it was trying to wash something away. She stood in the hallway, arms wrapped around herself, looking smaller than I remembered. I know it's late, she said. You don't have to say yes. I didn't ask what she wanted. I already knew. Can I stay here tonight? She asked. She didn't mean my bed. We both understood that. She meant my presence. My apartment, the simple fact of not being alone with her thoughts for one more night. She stayed on the couch. I took the chair across the room. We talked until the sky outside the windows began to lighten. She talked about fear, about how grief distorted time, how nights felt endless and days passed in a blur, about the shame of wanting comfort from someone who wasn't her husband, even when her husband was gone. I don't trust myself tonight, she admitted, and that scares me. You're allowed to be scared, I said. You've lost the one thing that made everything else make sense. Nothing happened that night, and yet, everything did, because in the quiet hours before morning, I realized something important. Sometimes the most powerful form of intimacy is restraint, the choice not to take advantage of vulnerability, even when it's offered freely. In the morning, she looked embarrassed, like she'd crossed some invisible line she hadn't meant to. I'm sorry if that was too much, she said. It wasn't, I replied. It was exactly what you needed. She smiled then, a small, genuine smile, the first I'd seen since her husband died. Weeks passed. Slowly, she began to find her footing again. She went out more. She talked about work. She even laughed, occasionally, the sound surprising both of us. But one day, she mentioned she might move. A fresh start, she said. Somewhere without so many memories pressed into the walls. I nodded and told her that made sense. When she finally did move, the hallway felt different again. Quieter, but not in the heavy way it had before. Just empty. I sometimes think about her, about that night, about the questions she asked. She never asked me to love her. She never asked me to save her. She asked me to stay. And sometimes, that's the most important thing anyone can do for another person. I didn't realize how much space one person could leave behind until she was gone. The day she moved out, I watched from my doorway as the last box was carried down the hallway. The movers were efficient, quiet, like they'd done this 1,000 times before, and knew better than to ask questions. She stood near the door of her apartment, arms crossed loosely over her chest, giving short directions, thanking them more than necessary. When it was over, she turned to me. Well, she said, forcing a small laugh. I guess this is it. I nodded. I wanted to say something meaningful, something that would wrap up everything we'd shared into a single sentence. Instead, I said the only honest thing I could think of. I'm glad you're going somewhere that feels lighter. She smiled at that. Not the fragile smile from weeks earlier, but something steadier. So am I. She hugged me then, briefly, carefully. It wasn't desperate or clinging. It felt like closure. When she walked away, I stood there longer than I needed to, listening to the echo of her footsteps fade. The hallway returned to its usual rhythm after that. New neighbors moved in eventually. Different voices, different routines, life filling the space the way it always does. But some nights, when the building went quiet, I still thought of her. I thought of how grief had entered my life sideways, through someone else's door. How it had taught me things no one ever warns you about. That loss isn't always loud. That love doesn't always look the way we expect it to. That being there for someone doesn't require fixing them, or saving them, or even fully understanding what they're going through. It just requires staying. I replayed that night off in the rain, the knock on my door, the way her voice sounded when she asked her question. Not because I wished things had been different, but because I understood how close we both had been to making choices that might have felt comforting in the moment and damaging later. Restraint isn't talked about enough. Neither is kindness without expectation. People assume that stories like this end with romance or regret, with a confession, or a mistake, or a dramatic turning point. The truth is, nothing that obvious ever happened, and that's why it stayed with me. Because what we shared existed in the space between what could have happened and what shouldn't. In the quiet understanding that sometimes the right thing to do doesn't feel exciting or brave in the moment. It just feels calm. Months later, I got a message from her. Just a short one. I wanted you to know, it read, that I'm okay. Not perfect. Not healed, but okay. And I don't think I would have gotten here without that night. I stared at my phone for a long time before replying. I'm glad, I typed back. You did the hard part. There was no follow-up. No lingering conversation, and that felt right. Life moved on. Mine did too. But every now and then, when I hear rain tapping against my window late at night, I think about how close to strangers can come without crossing a line. About how powerful it can be to offer someone a safe place to land when everything else has fallen apart. She didn't ask me for love. She didn't ask me for a future. She asked me for a night where she didn't have to be alone with her pain. And I think about how rare it is to be trusted with something like that. Some people pass through your life quietly. They don't leave scars or grand memories or dramatic stories you tell at parties. They leave something subtler. They leave you changed. And sometimes, long after they're gone, you realize that the most meaningful connections aren't the ones that take something from you, but the ones that teach you how to give without losing yourself. That night taught me that being present can be enough, that staying doesn't always mean staying forever, and that sometimes, the simplest question can carry the heaviest weight. Can I stay here tonight? She did, and because of that, we both survived. Asterisk, I used to think that stories only mattered if something happened in them. A kiss. A mistake? A choice you couldn't take back. That's how most people measure significance, by the size of the action. But after her, I stopped believing that because nothing dramatic happened between us. And yet the weight of it stayed longer than things that once felt world-changing. For a long time after she left, I caught myself listening for sounds that weren't there. The soft closing of her door across the hall, the brief pause before footsteps moved away, even the faint rhythm of her presence, something I hadn't realized I'd learned. Grief does that. Even when it isn't yours, it rewires you. I started noticing how fragile people were when they thought no one was watching. The way coworkers stayed late for no real reason. The way friends laughed too quickly, like they were afraid silence might expose something. The way strangers sometimes held eye contact a second longer than necessary, searching for permission to be honest. I saw her in them, and I wondered how many people were walking around every day, carrying a question they were too afraid to ask. Not a romantic one, not a reckless one, just a human one. Can I stay? Not forever. Not in your life. Not in your heart. Just here. Just now. Just until the night passes. We don't teach people how to ask that. And we don't teach people how to answer it without turning it into something else. There were moments later on when I questioned myself, when I wondered if I'd been too careful, if maybe I'd missed an opportunity that only comes once. Those thoughts usually showed up late at night, when nostalgia tends to rewrite history into something softer, more forgiving, but they never stayed long. Because I remembered her face the next morning. The calm in it, the relief, the absence of regret. I remembered how safe the moment felt, precisely because nothing had crossed a line. Safety is underrated, especially when someone's world has just collapsed. I dated after her, had relationships that were messy and imperfect and loud in the ways hers had never been, and yet, none of them taught me what she did in that quiet space between midnight and morning. She taught me that intimacy doesn't always mean closeness of body. Sometimes it means closeness of restraint, of trust, of understanding what not to take. She taught me that being chosen in someone's weakest moment is not an invitation to claim them, it's a responsibility to protect them. Years later, I still don't talk about her much, not because the story is painful, but because it's delicate, like something you don't want to cheapen by explaining too often. When people ask if I've ever been in love, I think of her, and I realize the answer isn't as simple as yes or no, because love doesn't always arrive wrapped in desire. Sometimes it arrives as presence, as patience, as the decision to sit with someone else's pain without making it about yourself. She didn't change my life in obvious ways. She didn't stay. She didn't leave behind promises or unfinished business. She left behind perspective, and that turned out to be enough. Some nights, when the building is quiet again, I sit by the window and listen to the rain. I let the memory come and go without grabbing onto it, without wishing it were different. Because some moments aren't meant to be they're meant to be understood. And I understand now that what she asked me for wasn't comfort or company or even safety. She asked me for permission to keep going. And I'm grateful I knew how to say yes without asking for anything in return. There's a strange thing that happens when a story ends without an ending. No final scene. No dramatic goodbye. No moment where everything makes sense all at once. Life just keeps going. At first, that unsettled me. I kept expecting a follow-up moment, a reason for the experience to justify itself in some obvious way. A phone call months later, a confession, a coincidence that tied everything together neatly. None of that ever came. And slowly, I realized that was the point. What we shared didn't need a conclusion because it wasn't a chapter in a larger romance or a missed opportunity waiting to be mourned. It was a moment of alignment between two people at the exact point where one of them might have fallen apart. Those moments don't announce themselves. They don't ask to be remembered. They just happen quietly, briefly, and then disappear. I think about how easily it could have gone wrong. How easily loneliness can disguise itself as desire. How grief can blur boundaries until even good intentions start to feel justified. How tempting it is to reach for something warm when the world has gone cold. There were nights after she moved away when I replayed the smallest details. The way she wrapped her hands around her mug, the pause before she spoke. The way her shoulders finally relaxed once she realized she wasn't expected to be anything but human. And every time, the same understanding surfaced. The reason the memory stayed gentle instead of painful was because we protected it. People underestimate how powerful that is. Most of us collect memories we have to make excuses for. Moments we explain away with "I didn't know any better," or "I was hurting," or "it just happened." Those memories don't fade, they bruise. This one didn't. Because when she asked to stay, she wasn't asking to escape her grief. She was asking to face it without being alone. And when I said yes, I wasn't offering myself. I was offering space. That difference matters more than people realize. I don't know where she is now. I don't know if she found what she was looking for, or if she even knows what that is yet. Healing isn't linear. It doesn't move in clean lines or tidy arcs. But I know this. The version of her that walked out of that building for the last time carried herself differently than the woman who once sat on the floor wrapped in a blanket that couldn't keep her warm. She stood taller. She breathed deeper. She wasn't healed, but she wasn't drowning anymore. And somehow, knowing I played a small part in that is enough. There's a quiet kind of gratitude that doesn't demand recognition. It doesn't need to be shared or spoken out loud. It just settles into you and changes the way you move through the world. After her, I became slower to assume things about people. Slower to label connections. Slower to take what was offered without asking why it was being offered. I learned to listen for what wasn't being said. Because sometimes the most important questions are hidden inside the simplest ones. Can I stay here tonight? It wasn't about the night. It wasn't about me. It was about survival. And maybe that's why the memory still feels heavy in the quiet moments. Not because it hurts, but because it mattered in a way that didn't need to announce itself. Some stories don't need to be told loudly. They just need to be remembered honestly. And this one always will be. I don't remember exactly when the memory stopped feeling immediate and started feeling distant. There wasn't a clear line. No day I woke up and thought, it's over now. It faded the way night does when you're not paying attention slowly. Almost politely, until one day you realize the light has changed. What stayed with me wasn't her face or her voice. It was the awareness she left behind, like a lens I couldn't take off. I began to notice how often people ask for things without really asking. How often do you have a minute? Actually means I don't want to go home yet. How often are you busy? Means I'm afraid to say I need you. How often can I stay? Is really please don't let me disappear tonight. Before her, I might have missed that. I might have answered the surface question and moved on, satisfied that I'd done my part. After her, I couldn't unsee the space between words and meaning. There was a night, about a year later, when a friend showed up at my place unannounced. He'd just gone through a breakup, not the dramatic kind, but the slow, mutual kind that leaves you unsure which loss hurts more, the person or the routine. He stood in my doorway, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, and said, "I don't really want to talk about it. I just don't want to be alone." I stepped aside and let him in without asking questions. As we sat there in silence, I thought of her, not in a nostalgic way, in a grateful one, because I knew, instinctively, how to be present without trying to turn the moment into something else. That's the thing about experiences like that. They don't repeat themselves, but they echo. People come and go. Circumstances change, but the lesson stays available, waiting for the next moment that needs it. I used to believe that the most meaningful connections were the ones that reshaped your life. The ones that led to something tangible, a relationship, a commitment, a shared future. Now I know better. Some connections are meaningful precisely because they don't lead anywhere, because they exist to stabilize you long enough to keep going, and then release you back into your own life without strings attached. They're bridges, not destinations. And bridges aren't meant to be lived on. I sometimes wonder if she thinks about that night the way I do, if it still holds the same quiet weight for her, or if it's been absorbed into the larger story of her healing, just one step among many. Maybe it doesn't matter. Maybe what matters is that, in the moment it counted, two people chose care over confusion, presence over impulse, respect over need. That choice didn't make our lives extraordinary. It didn't turn into a story people would lean in to hear at dinner parties. But it did something subtler. It preserved our dignity, and that's rare. We live in a world that rewards taking chances, taking risks, taking what you want while you can. There's nothing wrong with desire, or boldness, or reaching for happiness. But there's a kind of strength in knowing when not to reach. In recognizing when what someone is offering is not an invitation, but a trust. That night, she trusted me with her vulnerability, and I didn't mistake it for anything else. As time goes on, memories soften, edges blur, details fade, but certain truths remain sharp. That loneliness doesn't always need to be cured, sometimes it just needs to be witnessed. That grief isn't a problem to solve, it's a weight to be carried, often in silence. That staying doesn't require permanence, only intention. If I could speak to the version of myself who opened the door that rainy night, I wouldn't give advice. I wouldn't warn him or reassure him. I'd just tell him this: you don't need to do anything extraordinary. Just don't leave. Because sometimes, being there is the most meaningful thing you'll ever do, even if no one else ever knows it happened. And sometimes, long after the door has closed and the hallway has filled with different lives and different stories, you realize that a single quiet night changed the way you understand people forever. Not because of what was taken, but because of what was held and then gently let go.